Video footage suggests that several suspects employed military tactics during last week's assault on the Capitol. Senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge has been looking into this, and she joins us now from the Capitol. Catherine, what have you learned? I know that, there was one piece of video I was watching the other day. I found it so disturbing. It was clear that the rioters had taken shields from the officers, and then they were yelling instructions to each other about how to use the shields properly against the police officers. And I remember thinking at the time, man, that's not just some casual knowledge. These people know exactly what they're doing.
Well, Anne-Marie, good morning. A law enforcement official confirms to CBS News that the identification of rioters who use these military-style tactics is a Tier 1 priority for the U.S. Attorney's Sedition Task Force here in Washington.
With federal investigators sifting through more than 130,000 digital media tips, some videos stand out.
I ran this by probably 3 or 4 senior SWAT guys, and we all kind of agreed some kind of training.
Scott Sweeto is a former FBI and ATF explosives expert who investigated the 1995 Oklahoma City and 1996 Centennial Olympic Park bombings.
You have all these people that are facing away from the Capitol. They're singing. And then you have this group that is moving quickly and with a purpose up the steps of the Capitol. That's pretty scary when you look at what those people are doing.
Officials say former or current military and law enforcement have already been arrested for participating in last week's attack. The Pentagon says Jacob Fracker, one of 2 off-duty Virginia cops arrested for breaking into the Capitol, is a corporal in the Virginia National Guard. And the Army is still trying to determine the current status of Thomas Robertson, who apparently served at different times both for the National Guard and reserves. CBS News has learned videos like this drew immediate scrutiny because they mirror tactics used by law enforcement and the military to navigate hostile or unknown environments.
What are small unit tactics?
Small unit tactics are ways that military can blanket and communicate and try to get to a primary target that they have.
Frank Salufo is a former senior Homeland Security official.
This isn't out of a basement. This isn't playing a whole lot of video games. This is something that there was some training here. There's no question.
Once the Capitol was breached, CBS News has learned a D.C. police officer witnessed some rioters using military-style hand signals to communicate.
It would not be unusual for people to come up with physical signals such as tapping them, pulling on them, something that would work in a crowd where you had a lot of noise and a lot of chaos.
Why is the identification of individuals like this so important to the investigation?
At the end of the day, a small number of sophisticated actors can do a whole lot of harm.
This case is shaping up to be one of the largest in U.S. history that relies so heavily on videotape evidence. In addition to social media, CBS News is told that federal investigators are pouring through thousands of hours of closed-circuit TV security footage at the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Capitol building itself, as well as police body cam videos. Anne-Marie.
So do investigators know if these police officers and the soldiers that participated in this assault, whether or not, their presence is indicative of a larger problem of, anti-government elements in law enforcement or in the military?
First things first, really. The important thing, I'm told, is to identify these individuals and then to understand what their backgrounds are and whether there was pre-planning, premeditation, and coordination between these individuals. So if you have a small group like that video that we highlighted in our reporting, is that in isolation or is it part of something bigger? So that's why the identification, Anne-Marie, of these individuals is such a high priority for this sedition task force here in Washington.
So one of the men photographed that was sort of shared widely was in the chamber. He was holding zip ties, and he's a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel. He has been arrested. But what do we know about the investigation into him, and what do we know about what he intended to do with those zip ties?
Well, CBS News was really among the first media organizations to report, based on our law enforcement contacts, that investigators were exploring whether some of the rioters had come to harm lawmakers and even take hostages. And I was quickly pointed to two individuals who had what amount to makeshift handcuffs. One was a sort of plastic cuff, and the other were these zip ties that can function as handcuffs, especially in riot situations. So what we're seeing alleged here is the intent to take hostages on this Capitol Hill campus. And this further underscores how what happened last Wednesday really could have been so much more severe than what played out in the end.
As each day passes, we are learning more and more sort of disturbing information about all the things that went wrong on Wednesday. The Washington Post reported that dozens of suspected white supremacists successfully congregated in Washington, D.C., and many of them were on terrorist watch lists. What is your sense of, the threat level on the ground ahead of Joe Biden's swearing in on Wednesday?
Well, Anne-Marie, I first came to Washington, D.C. 1 month after 9/11 in October to cover then Homeland Security Advisor Tom Ridge. So I've seen the whole scope over the last 2 decades of the threat environment. This threat environment, I think, is one of the most intense I have seen during that time period, in part because there are multiple groups who are at play here, and the conditions have almost become like this, almost like a witch's brew of conditions. That intelligence bulletin that was just put out by FBI, Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center that tracks extremists talked about political divisions, racial divisions, the impact of the lockdown, and then the fraudulent allegations that the presidential election was stolen. You take all of that together, and it took disparate groups, it got them over that threshold from thinking about acting out violently to actually committing these acts of violence. And what I think was most concerning about that bulletin that I reviewed is that they say last week's overrun of the Capitol is really going to be a driver, they believe, of violence in the future, kind of like an accelerant, as opposed to being one bookend of the story.
It is not over yet. Catherine Herridge, thank you so much, Catherine.
You're welcome.